Half-melted wax dripped from the massive iron chandelier above, landing with a quiet, sickening hiss on the polished oak floor just inches from Brianna's satin slipper. She didn't flinch. Flinching would require acknowledging the physical space she occupied, and right now, her entire consciousness was funneled into the excruciating task of keeping her face entirely blank. Anthony had been gone for 26 minutes. He had left her standing by a towering arrangement of wilted white hydrangeas, promising to fetch a glass of iced lemonade. A simple domestic errand, a suitor's basic duty. Yet there he stood, 60 feet across the room, framed by the arched mahogany doorways of the Earl's suffocatingly hot ballroom. He wasn't holding a glass of lemonade. He was holding Lady Josephine's gloved hand, his thumb idly stroking the delicate lace at her wrist, his head bent intimately toward her ear. Brianna swallowed, but her throat felt lined with crushed glass. The air in the ballroom was thick, oppressive. It smelled of overripe flowers, the souring sweat of 300 bodies crammed into too small a space, and the heavy, choking powder the dowagers used to mask the scent of age. It smelled like a trap. Humiliation did not wash over her in a poetic, cold wave. It felt like a hot, prickly rash crawling up the back of her neck, settling behind her ears, making her skin crawl beneath the rigid, unyielding whalebone of her corset. She wasn't heartbroken. That was the cruelest irony of it all. She didn't feel the shattering of a grand romance, because there had been no grand romance. Anthony was merely a practical solution to a terrifying problem. He possessed a modest estate in Kent, a predictable temperament, and a mother who found Brianna suitably quiet. Brianna, at 24, possessed a dowry that could politely be described as an insult, and a sharp, cynical mind she spent every waking hour trying to hide. They were an equation that made sense. They had practically agreed upon a spring wedding just 2 days prior, but this public severing, executed without a single word of warning, in the dead center of the season's most brutally gossipy ball. It was a social execution. A sharp trill of laughter cut through the din of the string quartet. It was Anthony. It was that braying, eager sound he made whenever a man of higher rank spoke to him, but now he was making it for Josephine. Josephine, whose father owned half the shipping routes to the West Indies. Brianna's fingernails dug into the cheap silk of her fan. The small, rational part of her brain calculated her options. She could walk over there, interrupt them, and demand to be taken home. That would make her the hysterical, jilted woman. She could faint. No, the floor was slick with spilled wine and dirt from hundreds of boots. She would ruin her only decent gown. She could turn and flee, but the walk to the double doors was long, and she would have to run the gauntlet of the chaperones lined against the wall like a firing squad. Already the physical space around her was expanding. It was a subtle, brutal phenomenon. Couples dancing near her, edged slightly away. A cluster of young men by the punch bowl lowered their voices, throwing covert, pitying glances in her direction. The contagion of rejection was highly infectious in these rooms. No one wanted to stand too close to the girl who had just been publicly discarded, lest the stench of failure rub off on them. Brianna's eyes stung, a hot, angry pressure building behind them. She refused to cry. She dug her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger until the sharp bite of pain overrode the urge to weep. She felt incredibly stupid. She had bought a new ribbon for her hair tonight. She had spent an hour agonizing over the placement of a single curl against her neck, thinking Anthony might finally look at her with something resembling desire. Instead, she was standing alone, flanked by dying flowers, feeling the terrifying, hollow drop of her future disintegrating beneath her feet. The music swelled, a chaotic, jarring waltz that sounded violently out of tune. Brianna locked her knees to keep from trembling, staring fixedly at the dripping wax, waiting for the floor to mercifully open up and swallow her whole. The temperature in her immediate vicinity seemed to plunge. It wasn't a sudden, magical shift in the atmosphere, but a purely mechanical one. The dense crowd to her left physically repelled, parting like a bruised sea to make way for a man who did not ask for space. but simply occupied it with aggressive indifference. Lucius Hawley, the Duke of Westmore. Brianna caught the scent of him before she fully registered his presence. It cut through the cloying stench of the ballroom. A sharp, bracing shock of rain-soaked wool, camphor, and worn leather. There was no sweet cologne, no powdered hair. He smelled like the outdoors on a bitter November morning. He didn't swagger, nor did he glide. He walked with the heavy, measured, almost exhausted tread of a man who found the entire human race fundamentally exhausting. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and solid, and dressed in evening clothes that were immaculately tailored but completely devoid of the required fashionable embellishments. No silver embroidery, no sapphire pins, just stark, unyielding black and white. His face was a study in harsh angles, a nose that looked as though it had been broken years ago and set with careless impatience, a jaw permanently locked in tension, and eyes the colour of dirty ice. He was widely considered the most disagreeable man in London, a recluse who managed his massive northern estates with ruthless efficiency and treated polite society like a mild, recurring disease. Brianna braced herself, instinctively trying to shrink back into the hydrangeas. If Westmore was going to deliver a cutting remark to finish her off, she wasn't sure her knees would hold. He stopped directly beside her. He didn't bow. He didn't even look at her. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, staring straight across the room, his gaze locking with terrifying precision on Anthony and Lady Josephine. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound between them was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the cello from the orchestra pit. "He'll regret losing you." His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't sound comforting. It sounded like a threat leveled at the room at large. Brianna's head snapped toward him, her neck protesting the sudden movement. She stared at his profile, at the dark stubble shadowing his jaw that his valet had evidently given up trying to scrape away. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." Her voice shook, an embarrassing, reedy quiver that made her hate herself a little more. Lucius slowly turned his head to look down at her. His eyes didn't hold pity. Pity would have broken her. Instead, his gaze was coldly analytical, sweeping over her pale face, her rigid posture, and the white-knuckled grip she had on her fan. "I said," he repeated, the gravel in his voice scraping against her raw nerves, "he will regret losing you. Not tonight, perhaps. Tonight he is drunk on the prospect of shipping wealth and a girl who giggles at his mediocre jokes. But in 5 years, when he has gambled away her dowry and she realizes he is a man of spectacularly weak character, he will look back on the quiet, practical woman he discarded, and he will realize he made a catastrophic mathematical error." Brianna let out a short, breathy sound that was half gasp, half hysterical laugh. It was the most unromantic clinical defense she had ever heard, and it was the only thing that could have kept her upright. "Mathematical error," she repeated numbly. "Precisely." He shifted his weight, the starched linen of his shirt front creaking softly. "You are standing by the punch bowl looking like a calf waiting for the slaughterhouse bolt. It is depressing the room, and I am already finding the evening intolerable." Brianna stiffened, the spark of genuine anger finally overriding her humiliation. "My apologies, Your Grace. I shall try to have my life ruined more quietly so as not to disturb your mood." A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch affected the corner of Lucius's mouth. It wasn't a smile, but it was a cessation of hostility. "Do not apologize. It proves him right," Lucius said flatly. He didn't offer a gentle, inviting hand. He merely jutted his elbow out toward her, a solid, immovable angle draped in black broadcloth. "If you remain here for another 3 minutes, Lady Jersey will descend upon you with false condolences and ensure your ruin is absolute by tomorrow morning. You require an exit strategy. I require a shield from the Duchess of Marlborough, who is currently stalking me with her terrifyingly unwed daughters. Walk with me." Brianna stared at his elbow. It felt like a trap of a different kind. To take the Duke of Westmore's arm was to invite a level of scrutiny she had spent her life successfully avoiding. But she looked across the room. Anthony was leading Josephine onto the dance floor, The musicians were raising their bows. The scent of camphor and rain seemed to clear a small pocket of oxygen in the stifling air. Brianna closed her fan with a sharp, definitive snap, slipped her gloved hand through his arm, and gripped his sleeve. Underneath the fine wool, his forearm felt like a bar of iron. "An exit strategy," she murmured, feeling the heat of hundreds of staring eyes turn toward them as she took a step forward. "Indeed," Lucius said, his voice rumbling in his chest, vibrating against her hand. "Try not to step on my boots. I had them polished." They did not walk toward the double doors leading to the quiet, dark street outside. Brianna realized this with a jolt of panic as Lucius steered her, with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train, directly toward the center of the ballroom floor. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her fingers involuntarily tightening on his arm. The muscles beneath the wool flexed slightly in response. "Retreating immediately looks like running," Lucius replied, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the crowd. "We do not run. We occupy the space until the space belongs to us, and then we leave on our own terms." "I don't know how to occupy space," she whispered frantically, the heat of the room suddenly crashing back over her. "I am perfectly designed to blend in with the wallpaper." "Then tonight you will be very loud wallpaper." Before she could protest further, he turned to face her. The string quartet struck the first heavy chords of a Vienna waltz. It was a notoriously intimate dance, one that required a proximity Brianna was entirely unaccustomed to. Lucius did not ask for permission. He placed his large, calloused hand on her waist. The heat of his palm bled instantly through the thin silk of her gown and the heavy canvas of her corset, settling into her skin like a brand. His other hand engulfed hers, lifting it into the air. He was entirely too close. She had to tilt her head back uncomfortably to look at his face. The aggressive scent of pine and rain was overpowering now, drowning out the sour breath and decaying flowers of the room. "I am a terrible dancer," she warned him, her voice barely audible over the sweeping violins. "I count the steps in my head. I have no natural rhythm." "Good. Rhythm is for the unpredictable," he said, stepping into her space and forcing her to step back on the downbeat. "Count out loud if you must. Just do not look at him." They began to turn. It wasn't a graceful soaring waltz. Lucius danced exactly as he walked, with heavy, precise, unyielding authority. He didn't guide her. He moved her. Brianna had to scramble for the first few bars, simply to keep her footing, her slippers sliding dangerously on the waxed floor. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, she muttered under her breath, staring at the knot of his stark white cravat. "You are tense," he observed. It wasn't a gentle observation. It was a factual report. "Your shoulders are currently leveled with your earlobes." "I was just abandoned in front of polite society by a man who possesses the intellectual depth of a soup spoon," she shot back, the adrenaline finally loosening her tongue. "Forgive me if I am not entirely relaxed, Your Grace." Lucius spun them sharply to avoid colliding with a portly earl. Brianna's hip crashed lightly against his thigh. He was as solid as a stone pillar. "A soup spoon has utility," Lucius noted dryly. "Anthony has none. Why were you marrying him?" The sheer audacity of the question knocked the breath out of her. Society dictated that one did not mention the tragedy to the victim while the wound was still bleeding. But Lucius Hawley was clearly not a man who cared for the dictates of society. Brianna looked up from his cravat, meeting those cold, pale eyes. They were completely devoid of judgment. He wasn't mocking her. He was genuinely asking for data. "Because I am 24, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My father is dead. My brother's wife despises me, and my dowry would barely purchase a decent carriage. Anthony was safe. He was foolish enough to want to feel superior to his wife, and I was exhausted enough to let him." She expected a lecture on the sanctity of marriage, or perhaps a condescending pat on the hand. Instead, Lucius nodded once, a sharp, validating motion. "A pragmatic transaction," he said, "except you failed to account for his vanity. Vain men are volatile investments. I am aware of that now, she snapped, stepping heavily on the toe of his right boot. Lucius didn't wince. He didn't even break stride. He merely tightened his grip on her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor for half a second to force her back onto the correct beat. Do that again, and I will step on yours, he warned softly. A startled, genuine laugh punched its way out of Brianna's throat. It was a rusty, ugly sound, but it felt incredible. The crushing, suffocating weight that had been pressing on her chest for the last 30 minutes cracked slightly, letting in a sliver of cold, sharp air. They are staring, she observed, acutely aware of the whispering that had swept through the room like a brush fire. Even Anthony and Josephine had stopped dancing, staring in open-mouthed shock at the sight of the notorious Duke of Westmore waltzing with the discarded wallflower. Let them stare, Lucius said, his voice vibrating deep in his chest. Their brains are entirely consumed by the effort of determining why I am dancing with you. By tomorrow, they will have convinced themselves that you possess some hidden, extraordinary value that Anthony was too stupid to see. Do I? She asked, the cynicism returning, biting at the edges of her relief. Possess extraordinary value. Lucius looked down at her. His gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second, then snapped back to her eyes. The coldness in his stare was momentarily fractured by something else, something intense, restless, and completely terrifying. You did not cry when he humiliated you, Lucius said quietly, the harshness fading from his voice, leaving only a low rumble. You stood there, calculating your survival. In my world, madam, survival is the only value that matters. The music reached a sweeping crescendo. Lucius halted their spin with jarring suddenness, near the towering double doors that led out to the terrace. He dropped his hand from her waist, the sudden absence of his heat leaving a cold, aching void on her side. The space is occupied, he said, stepping back and offering his arm once more. Now, we leave. Brianna didn't hesitate. She took his arm, lifted her chin, and let the cold Duke of Westmore lead her out of the suffocating heat, leaving a room completely paralyzed by confusion in their wake. Cobblestones rattled violently beneath the iron-rimmed wheels, sending a jarring vibration straight up Brianna's spine. The interior of the Duke's carriage was pitch black, save for the intermittent, sickly yellow flashes of passing gas street lamps filtering through the rain-streaked glass. It was freezing. The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight in the ballroom evaporated the moment the heavy carriage door snapped shut, leaving a cold, nauseating hollow in her stomach. Her teeth began to chatter. It wasn't a delicate, ladylike shiver. It was a harsh, rhythmic clicking of her jaw that she couldn't control. She clamped her teeth down hard on her own tongue, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of blood just to force her mouth closed. Across the narrow space, Lucius sat cloaked in shadows. He took up an absurd amount of room. His knees, encased in black wool, nearly brushed the damp silk of her skirt. He didn't offer her a blanket. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He merely sat. A dense mass of quiet breathing and the lingering smell of wet leather. You are hyperventilating, he noted. The gravelly voice emerged from the darkness, completely devoid of alarm. I am cold, Brianna lied, her voice tight and breathy. And I have just realized that my brother is going to turn me out into the street by noon tomorrow. Escaping a humiliation does not erase it, Your Grace. It simply moves the venue of my ruin. A street lamp washed over the carriage interior for half a second. It illuminated the stark planes of his face. He was looking out the window, his jaw working slowly, as if chewing on a complex piece of gristle. Your brother, Lucius stated, pulling his gaze away from the glass to look at the vague outline of her in the dark. Theodore, a man who recently lost £600 at White's backing a horse with a known limp. He required Anthony's modest settlement to cover a fraction of his debts to his butcher. Brianna stiffened. The cold in the carriage seemed to sharpen. You have investigated my family. I investigate everything that crosses my field of vision. It is a reflex. He shifted, the heavy leather squabs of the seat groaning under his weight. You were marrying a fool to escape a fool. A lateral move. It would have ended in disaster. It was a roof, Brianna snapped, the fear finally boiling over into a raw, desperate anger. She leaned forward, gripping the velvet handstrap so tightly her knuckles popped. It was food on a table, and a locked door, and the absence of my sister-in-law's daily reminders that I am an expensive burden. It was not a lateral move to me. It was a lifeline, and Anthony cut it, and now I am drowning. So do not sit there and analyze my life as if it were a ledger you are casually auditing. Silence descended again, heavy and thick. Brianna slumped back against the seat, instantly regretting her outburst. One did not yell at the Duke of Westmore. One barely made eye contact with him. She waited for him to tap the roof, halt the carriage, and deposit her on the wet pavement. Instead, he let out a low, slow breath. A ledger, he murmured. An apt analogy. Let us audit it then. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. I possess a house in Yorkshire. It is massive, freezing, and perpetually falling apart, he began, his tone remarkably conversational, though the subject matter was entirely clinical. It requires a manager. The servants are insolent because I am never there. And when I am, I lack the patience to discipline them without resorting to property damage. My estates yield £30,000 a year, yet my housekeeper cannot seem to purchase a decent cut of mutton. Furthermore, the local gentry view my bachelorhood as a personal insult and lay siege to my gates every autumn with their marriageable daughters. Brianna stared at him, her heart beating a frantic, confused rhythm against her ribs. I do not understand what your mutton has to do with my brother's butcher. It has everything to do with it. Lucius reached into his coat pocket. The faint sound of a silver clasp snapping open echoed in the small space. I require a deterrent, a wife, but I refuse to marry a woman who expects poetry or shared bedchambers or endless seasons in London. I want someone who understands the arithmetic of survival, someone who will take my name, lock the gates of Hawley Hall against the world, fix the wretched staff, and leave me in complete peace to manage my mines. He held out his hand. In the darkness, Brianna couldn't see what he was holding, but she heard the soft clink of metal. I am offering you a position, Brianna, he said, using her Christian name for the first time. It sounded strange in his mouth, harsh, yet intensely grounding. I will clear Theodore's debts. I will settle £5,000 upon you independently. You will have a roof, an unlimited household budget, and the absolute highest rank in the county. In exchange, you will demand nothing of me emotionally, and you will ensure I am never bothered by another matchmaking mother for the rest of my natural life. Brianna stopped breathing. The carriage jolted violently over a rut, throwing her shoulder hard against the brass fitting of the window, but she barely registered the bruise. She stared at the dark shape of his hand. It wasn't a proposal. It was an employment contract. It was the most brutally insulting, completely unromantic, utterly terrifying thing she had ever heard. You want to hire me to be your wife, she whispered, the sheer absurdity of it making her dizzy. I want to purchase my peace of mind, he corrected flatly. And you want to purchase your independence. We are both desperate people, madam. My desperation simply has a higher budget. The carriage began to slow. They were nearing Theodore's modest townhouse. The street lamps grew sparser, the darkness pressing in against the wet glass. I do not know you, she said, her voice shaking. You have a terrible reputation. I earned every bit of it, Lucius agreed without hesitation. I am unyielding, I have a foul temper, and I find most human interaction physically painful. I will not be a kind husband, but I will be an absent one, and I will never, under any circumstances, humiliate you in a crowded room. The carriage ground to a halt. The iron wheels scraped against the curb. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming a frantic rhythm on the wooden roof. Think on it, Lucius said, pulling his hand back. I will call at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you are not in the drawing room, I will assume you have chosen the street." Before the footman even reached the handle, Lucius pushed the carriage door open himself. The bitter, wet wind howled into the cabin, instantly freezing the sweat on Brianna's neck. He did not offer his hand to help her down. He merely sat back into the shadows, a dark, immovable force, watching her step out into the rain. Grey dawn light dragged itself across the threadbare rug of Brianna's bedchamber, illuminating a room that smelled of stale ashes and cheap lavender soap. She hadn't slept. She had spent the last 7 hours sitting upright in a hard-backed chair, fully dressed in her ruined silk gown, staring at a crack in the plaster ceiling. Downstairs, the house was waking up, and the sounds were not gentle. A door slammed so hard the floorboards beneath Brianna's chair vibrated. Then came Clara's voice, a shrill, reedy pitch that could cut through stone. "She is a complete idiot, Theodore. A willful, stupid girl. Lady Jersey's maid told our cook that Anthony practically ran from her." Ran? What did she say to him? She must have insulted his mother again. Brianna closed her eyes. The headache that had been threatening her since midnight finally bloomed behind her temples. A dull, throbbing ache. She slowly stood, her joints popping in protest, and walked to the small wash basin. The water in the pitcher had a thin crust of ice on it. She broke it with her knuckle, the sharp cold shocking her system, and splashed it onto her face. By the time she descended the narrow, unlit staircase, the screaming in the dining room had reached a fever pitch. Theodore was pacing in front of the unlit hearth, chewing frantically on the end of an unlit cigar. Clara sat at the table, aggressively shredding a piece of cold toast. "Ah, the wallflower descends," Clara sneered as Brianna crossed the threshold. "Have you packed your trunks? Because you certainly cannot stay here. We are ruined. The butcher refused our credit this morning." He laughed in the maid's face. Theodore stopped pacing, rounding on his sister with a red, sweating face. "What happened? I demand to know what happened. Anthony was secured. The contracts were drawn." "Anthony found Lady Josephine's £50,000 vastly more appealing than my face, Theodore," Brianna said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. It was entirely flat. The panic of the previous night had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard ash. "And the Duke?" Clara demanded, leaning forward, her eyes glittering with a toxic mix of greed and disbelief. "The gossips say you left with the Duke of Westmore. Did you throw yourself at him? Did you think a duke would stoop to pick up Anthony's discarded scraps?" Brianna walked to the sideboard. She picked up a lukewarm teapot and poured a measure of brown bitter water into a chipped cup. The heavy, scratched silver felt heavy in her hand. "The Duke gave me a ride home," Brianna said, taking a sip. It tasted like metal and old leaves. "That is all." Clara let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Of course he did. He pitied you. You are a charity case, Brianna. A 24-year-old spinster who cannot even hold on to a man who smells faintly of cabbage." The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime. 10 heavy, reverberating strikes. Brianna set the teacup down. The porcelain rattled slightly against the saucer. Her heart, which she thought had gone entirely numb, gave a single violent kick against her ribs. On the final chime, a knock sounded at the front door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was 3 heavy, measured strikes of a heavy walking stick against the oak, echoing through the small house like a cannon blast. The maid scurried down the hall. A moment later, the dining room door was pushed open. Not by the maid, but by Lucius Hawley. He seemed to suck all the available oxygen out of the cramped room instantly. He was dressed in a dark grey riding coat, damp from the morning drizzle, his boots caked with street mud that he made absolutely no effort to wipe on the mat. He didn't take his hat off immediately. He stood in the doorway, his cold, pale eyes sweeping over the dismal breakfast spread, over Clara's gaping mouth, and finally resting on Theodore, who had dropped his cigar onto the carpet. "You are Theodore," Lucius stated. It wasn't a question. He sounded deeply unimpressed. Yes, Your Grace. Theodore practically fell over himself, attempting a bow, his face draining of all colour. We did not expect. I am not here for your expectations, Lucius cut him off smoothly. He stripped his leather gloves off, tossing them carelessly onto the table next to Clara's shredded toast. He finally turned his gaze to Brianna. She stood by the sideboard, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany. She hadn't changed her dress. She looked pale, exhausted, and bruised. Lucius held her gaze for 3 long seconds. A silent, heavy question hung in the air between them. Did you choose the street? Brianna forced her chin up. She deliberately let go of the sideboard, standing under her own power. She gave him a fraction of a nod. The corner of Lucius's mouth twitched. That same, imperceptible cessation of hostility she had seen in the ballroom. He turned his broad back on her, focusing his absolute, terrifying attention on Theodore. I am marrying your sister, Lucius announced. He didn't ask for her hand. He delivered a military briefing. The banns will be read by special license. We depart for Yorkshire tomorrow. Clara let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, clutching her throat. Theodore looked as though he might violently vomit. Marrying? Theodore choked out. Your Grace, We had no idea there was an attachment. There isn't, Lucius said bluntly, pulling a thick envelope from his inner pocket and dropping it onto the table with a heavy thud. This contains a draft drawn on the Bank of England for your current debts, and a sum to ensure you never contact my wife for financial aid again. If I discover you have asked her for so much as a shilling, I will buy the promissory notes on this house and burn it to the ground with your wretched furniture inside. He didn't raise his voice. He delivered the threat with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. You are buying her, Clara breathed, horrified but unable to tear her eyes away from the thick envelope. Lucius finally looked at the sister-in-law. His eyes narrowed, the grey darkening to the colour of wet slate. I am salvaging an undervalued asset from a mismanaged estate, madam. Pack her trunks. Have them in the foyer by noon. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots crushing Theodore's dropped cigar into the carpet, and walked back out the door. The front door clicked shut softly behind him, a final, definitive seal on Brianna's fate. She stared at the empty doorway, the smell of damp wool and camphor lingering in the air, masking the scent of the cheap soap. She had sold herself. But as she looked at her brother's trembling hands and Clara's stunned silence, she realized something profound. She was no longer the prey in the room. Iron gates groaned, a deep metallic screech that tore through the howling wind. Brianna pressed her cheek against the freezing glass of the carriage window. Hawley Hall did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress constructed for a war that had ended centuries ago. A massive, sprawling beast of black stone crouched defensively against the jagged Yorkshire moors. There were no manicured gardens, no welcoming gravel sweeps, just acres of bruised purple heather, driving rain, and a structure that seemed actively hostile to the idea of human habitation. They had been married 3 days ago in a freezing London chapel. It had taken exactly 14 minutes. Lucius had placed a heavy, unadorned gold band on her finger, signed the register with a viciously sharp stroke of his pen, and ushered her into a travelling chaise before the vicar could even offer his congratulations. The journey north had been a study in endurance. They had spoken perhaps 50 words to each other over 300 miles. Lucius spent the hours reading agricultural reports, his brow furrowed, occasionally marking a page with a piece of charcoal. Brianna had spent the time staring out the window, watching the landscape turn increasingly brutal, realizing with cold clarity that she had traded a small, cramped cage for a massive, echoing one. The carriage lurched to a halt in the inner courtyard. The rain was torrential now, a solid sheet of grey water turning the cobblestones into a shallow lake. Before the footman could unfold the steps, Lucius threw the door open. He didn't wait for an umbrella. He stepped out into the downpour, the wind instantly whipping his dark hair across his forehead. He turned, reaching a large, gloved hand back inside the carriage. "Move quickly," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the gale. "The damp here settles into the bones." Brianna took his hand. He practically hauled her out of the carriage, his grip iron tight. He didn't let go as they half ran up the wide, slippery stone steps. He positioned his large body between her and the worst of the wind, taking the brunt of the storm against his back until they crossed the threshold. The massive oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the storm with unnatural suddenness. Brianna stood dripping in the cavernous entrance hall. It smelled of wood smoke, wet dogs, and centuries of undisturbed dust. The walls were lined with dark, rotting tapestries and suits of armor that looked entirely too real. The floor was black flagstone, uneven and bitter cold even through the thin soles of her boots. A handful of servants stood in a loose, ragged line near the sweeping stone staircase. They didn't look like the polished, deferential staff of a London house. They looked hardened, their faces weathered, staring at Brianna with open, calculating suspicion. "Mrs. Hughes!" Lucius barked, shaking the water from his heavy driving coat like a massive hound. A severe woman in a dark grey dress stepped forward. She possessed a face that looked as though it had been carved from the local granite. "Your Grace, we did not receive your letter regarding a companion. Wife," Lucius corrected, his voice dropping an octave, echoing dangerously off the vaulted ceiling. "The Duchess of Westmore. You will address her as such." Mrs. Hughes's eyes flicked to Brianna, cold and unimpressed. She offered a microscopic curtsy. "Your Grace." Lucius stripped off his wet gloves, tossing them onto a heavily carved table. He didn't introduce Brianna further. He didn't offer a tour. He didn't even look at her. "Have a fire lit in the East Wing Master Suite," he instructed the housekeeper, his mind clearly already shifting to a dozen other things. "Send up a hot bath, and find my steward. I want the ledgers for the Lower Valley mines on my desk in 20 minutes. He finally turned to Brianna. The water was dripping from his jaw, trailing down the harsh slope of his neck into the collar of his shirt. "Mrs. Hughes will show you to your rooms. The keys to the household are in my study. Retrieve them tomorrow morning. You have absolute authority over this house. If they refuse an order, sack them." He spoke to her exactly as he had spoken to the footman. "Where are you going?" Brianna asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. She hated how small her voice sounded in the massive cavern of the hall. Lucius paused, one foot on the bottom stair. He looked back at her. The distance between them was only 10 feet, but it felt like a chasm. "To work," he said simply. "I told you, Brianna. I brought you to manage the house so I do not have to. I am going to the mines. I will likely not return until dinner. Ensure there is edible food when I do." He turned and walked up the stairs, his heavy boots striking the stone with absolute finality. He didn't look back. Brianna stood shivering in the foyer, the cold water from her hem pooling onto the black flagstones. The servants watched her, waiting to see if the new Duchess would crumble. She closed her eyes, pulling in a deep, shaky breath of the dusty, wood-smoke-filled air. She thought of Anthony's whining laugh. She thought of Clara's sneer. She looked down at the heavy gold ring on her left hand. It was cold against her skin. He had abandoned her in a hallway, true, but he had given her the keys. Brianna opened her eyes, turning her gaze directly onto Mrs. Hughes. She forced her spine completely straight, ignoring the violent shivering in her shoulders. "I prefer my bathwater to be scalding, Mrs. Hughes," Brianna said, pitching her voice to match the flat, unyielding tone she had learned from her new husband. "And kindly inform the cook that if she serves boiled mutton tonight, she will be looking for new employment in the morning. Show me the stairs. Sauce, brass keys, 32 of them threaded onto a heavy iron ring, dug violently into the soft flesh of Brianna's palm. She squeezed her hand shut anyway, welcoming the sharp bite of the metal. It was a tangible reminder of the authority she possessed, an authority she was currently using to dismantle the hostile regime of Hawley Hall. 3 weeks had passed since she arrived in the biting Yorkshire rain. 3 weeks of inhaling the acrid scent of ancient dust, of tasting salt pork that had been improperly cured, and of engaging in a silent, brutal war of attrition with Mrs. Hughes. Brianna stood in the subterranean gloom of the kitchens, the heat from the massive roasting spits pressing against her face like a damp woolen blanket. The air was thick with the smell of scorched flour and old grease. "I am looking at the butcher's receipts, Mrs. Gable," Brianna said. Her voice was flat, carrying no accusation, only a devastating recitation of facts. She ran a gloved finger down the ledger resting on the flour-dusted butcher block. "You have charged the estate for prime beef loin every Tuesday for 6 months. Yet, what was served at the Duke's table last night, and the Tuesday prior, was unquestionably shin meat. Tough, stringy, and boiled to the consistency of a riding boot. The cook, a massive woman with arms like hams and a perpetual sneer, slammed a heavy iron skillet onto the stove. The Duke never complained. The Duke does not notice what he consumes because he views food as fuel, not a pleasure," Brianna countered smoothly, closing the ledger with a sharp snap that echoed off the stone walls. "I, however, notice. I also notice that your nephew owns the butcher shop in the village. A very tidy arrangement. You overcharge the estate for prime cuts, serve the cheapest available scrap, and split the difference." Mrs. Gable's ruddy face drained of colour, leaving a mottled greyish panic behind. She looked toward Mrs. Hughes, who was standing rigid by the pantry door, for support. Mrs. Hughes offered none. She merely stared at Brianna with a new, deeply reluctant apprehension. "You will pack your belongings, Mrs. Gable." "You are dismissed," Brianna said, turning her back on the woman before the protest could even form. "Mrs. Hughes, promote the undercook. If I am served boiled meat again, I will dismiss her as well, and you along with her. Have the East Wing drawing room aired out with lavender and vinegar. It smells like a tomb." She walked out of the kitchen, her spine straight, the heavy brass keys clinking softly against her skirt in a rhythmic cadence of victory. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated confrontations. They made her stomach sour and her chest tight, but she shoved the weakness down into the dark, cynical box where she kept her ruined dreams of a quiet life. She was the Duchess of Westmore. She had a job to do. That evening, the dining room was marginally less freezing. Brianna had bullied the footman into dragging a massive brazier closer to the table, and the fire in the hearth was actually producing heat rather than just smoking miserably. Lucius entered exactly at 7 o'clock. He looked exhausted. The sharp planes of his face were shadowed with dirt and coal dust, and his knuckles were scraped raw. He smelled of sulphur, sweat, and wet earth. He didn't apologize for his appearance. He dropped his heavy frame into the chair at the head of the long oak table, pouring himself a glass of claret before the footman could even reach for the decanter. Brianna sat at the opposite end, 15 feet away, an ocean of polished wood between them. The doors opened, and the footman carried in the silver platters. Not boiled mutton, roast beef, charred perfectly on the outside, bleeding a rich dark red juice onto the carving board, accompanied by roasted root vegetables glistening with thyme and butter. Lucius stopped midway through a sip of wine. His pale eyes tracked the platter as it was set before him. He stared at the meat for a long, silent moment. Then he looked down the length of the table at Brianna. "Mrs. Gable is gone," he stated. It wasn't a question. "She was embezzling from the household accounts to line her nephew's pockets," Brianna replied, cutting a small piece of beef on her own plate. The knife slid through the meat like butter. "I sacked her. The undercook shows promise, provided she is properly terrified." A low sound rumbled in Lucius's chest. It took Brianna a second to realize it was a chuckle. It was a rough, unused sound, like gravel grinding under a cartwheel. "Mrs. Hughes attempted to intercept me in the hallway to complain of your tyranny," he said, picking up his fork. "I told her that if she spoke ill of my wife again, I would have her thrown into the horse trough." Brianna's knife paused against the china. She looked up. Lucius was already eating, tearing into the beef with the predatory efficiency of a starving wolf. He didn't look at her, but the tension in his shoulders seemed marginally less rigid than usual. "You defended me," she said softly. Lucius paused, swallowing heavily. He dragged a linen napkin across his mouth. I defended my investment. You are performing the exact function I required of you. The house is warmer. The ledgers in my study are balanced. And this is the first meal I have eaten in my own dining room in 3 years that does not taste like despair. It was the most practical, bloodless compliment she had ever received. Yet, as she took a bite of her own dinner, the rich, savory taste flooding her mouth, Brianna felt a strange, tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. She wasn't loved. She wasn't cherished. But she was useful. She was competent. And for a woman who had spent her entire life feeling like a useless burden, competence was a deeply intoxicating drug. Rain hammered against the mullioned windows of the library, driven by a violent northern gale that rattled the heavy frames in their sockets. It was past 2 in the morning. Brianna sat curled in a leather armchair near the dying fire, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, reviewing the winter fuel projections. She couldn't sleep. The howling wind sounded too much like the screaming arguments between Theodore and Clara that used to keep her awake in London. The heavy oak door slammed open. Brianna jolted, the ledger slipping from her lap and hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. Lucius stood in the doorway. He was completely soaked, his riding coat heavy and black with rain, dripping a steady puddle onto the floorboards. But it wasn't the rain that made Brianna's breath catch in her throat. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face the colour of dirty chalk. His left hand was clamped tightly over his right forearm, and dark, thick blood was steadily seeping between his fingers, running down his wrist to drip a gruesome, rhythmic patter onto the floor. Lucius, Brianna breathed, the name slipping out instinctively. He didn't acknowledge it. He pushed off the doorframe, staggering slightly as he walked toward the heavy mahogany desk. Do not wake the staff. Just find me some whiskey and a clean rag. His voice was tightly controlled, a harsh rasp born of excruciating pain. Brianna didn't freeze. The same survival instinct that had kept her upright in the ballroom surged through her now, sharp and cold. She practically threw the shawl off her shoulders, rushing to the side table where the crystal decanters sat. She poured a massive measure of amber liquid into a glass, then ran to a linen drawer near the fireplace, pulling out several clean napkins used for afternoon tea. When she reached the desk, Lucius had managed to strip off his heavy coat, though the effort left him breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He sank into his desk chair, his arm resting heavily on the blotter. His white linen shirt was soaked in crimson from the elbow down. What happened? She demanded, setting the glass down and immediately reaching for his arm. One of the pumping engines at the lower seam seized, he grunted, grabbing the whiskey and downing it in a single violent swallow. I attempted to clear the jam. A gear slipped. The casing cracked and caught my arm. Brianna pulled the ruined, blood-soaked sleeve back. She had to swallow down a sudden surge of bile. The gash was deep, a jagged, ugly tear through the muscle that exposed the yellow-white flash of bone beneath. The smell of fresh, hot blood, sharp, metallic, and overwhelming, filled the small space between them. You need a surgeon. This needs stitches, she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. The village doctor is a drunk who would likely amputate it to save himself the effort of sewing. Lucius ground out, his head falling back against the leather chair, his eyes squeezed shut. Bind it tightly. It will hold until morning. It will not hold, you stubborn fool. You are bleeding on your own accounts, she snapped, panic making her voice sharp. Lucius opened one eye, staring at her through a haze of pain. Did you just call me a fool? I did, and I will call you worse if you bleed to death on my clean rugs, she shot back. She grabbed the first linen napkin, folding it into a thick square. Hold still. This is going to hurt. She didn't wait for his permission. She pressed the thick linen pad directly into the open wound, bearing down with as much of her body weight as she could manage. Lucius's entire body went rigid. A raw, guttural sound tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony that made the hairs on Brianna's arms stand up. His free hand shot out, grabbing her hip to steady himself, his fingers digging into her corset with bruising force. "Breathe," she ordered, her face inches from his. She could smell the rain on his skin, mixed with the sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Keep breathing." For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sounds in the room were the howling wind outside, Lucius's ragged breathing, and the soft, terrible squelch of blood soaking into the linen. Brianna's arms ached from the pressure, her hands cramping, but she didn't let up. Slowly, the bleeding began to slow. "You have a steady hand," Lucius murmured, his voice faint, his eyes fixed on her face. Brianna didn't look up from his arm as she reached for a second napkin to begin binding the wound tightly. "I spent 4 years sewing Theodore's torn waistcoats when he returned from pub brawls. One learns to manage blood. Theodore is an idiot." Lucius shifted slightly, his grip on her hip loosening, though he didn't pull his hand away. The heat of his palm seeped through her thin gown. "You are not. You did not scream. You did not faint. I told you, Your Grace, I am a pragmatic investment." She pulled the makeshift bandage tight, tying a harsh knot that made him flinch. "Stop calling me that," he said quietly. Brianna finally looked up. His face was only inches from hers. The cold, analytical detachment that usually shielded his eyes was gone, stripped away by the pain and the exhaustion. What remained was something dangerously intense, something that looked at her not as a ledger entry, but as a living, breathing woman. "Calling you what?" she whispered. "Your Grace. It sounds like an insult when you say it." He lifted his uninjured hand, his knuckles brushing against a loose curl that had escaped her pins and fallen against her cheek. His touch was rough, calloused, and shockingly gentle. "My name is Lucius." Brianna's heart gave a violent, painful kick against her ribs. She was acutely aware of the smell of the copper blood, the heat of the fire, and the massive, overwhelming presence of the man in the chair. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had built a fortress around himself to survive, much like she had. "Lucius," she repeated, the name tasting strange and heavy on her tongue. He stared at her mouth for a long moment. Then, his eyes fluttered shut, his head dropping back against the chair. "I am going to pass out now, Brianna. Kindly do not let me fall onto the floor." He went entirely limp. Brianna caught his broad shoulders before he could slide sideways, bracing his heavy weight against her chest. She stood in the quiet library, holding her unconscious, bleeding husband, and realized with a terrifying jolt of clarity that she no longer wanted to leave Hawley Hall. She wanted to lock the gates and swallow the key. Winter broke its back in late February. The snowmelt turned the moors into a treacherous, sucking bog, but the air lost its biting edge, smelling faintly of wet loam and impending spring. Brianna sat at the desk in her private sitting room, staring at a piece of heavy, cream-colored parchment. It had arrived in the Morning Post. The wax seal was a sloppy, smeared mess, Theodore's crest. The words on the page were a frantic, pathetic scrawl. "Brianna, you must implore the Duke for a loan. I am ruined. But it is not just me. London is buzzing. Anthony's new bride, Josephine, eloped with a French cavalry officer last week, taking the entirety of her accessible dowry. Anthony is begging his creditors for mercy. He is a laughingstock. Clara says he mentioned you at a dinner party, saying he made a terrible mistake. Please, sister, we have nowhere else to turn." Brianna read the letter 3 times. She waited for the familiar spike of vindictive joy, the triumphant satisfaction of knowing her humiliator had been humiliated. It didn't come. Instead, she felt absolutely nothing. Anthony was a ghost, a pale, insignificant memory of a life she no longer recognized. He belonged to a world of wilted hydrangeas and polite terror. She belonged to the moors. She belonged to the heavy brass keys, the scent of wood smoke, and a man whose harshness was the most honest thing she had ever known. "You are frowning." Brianna jumped, her hand instinctively flattening over the letter. Lucius stood in the doorway connecting their suites. It was the first time he had opened that door since the day they arrived. He was out of his riding clothes, wearing a loose white shirt unbuttoned at the throat and dark trousers. The bandage on his arm was gone, replaced by a thick, angry red scar he made no effort to hide. He looked rested. He looked dangerous. "It is a letter from Theodore," she said, deciding instantly not to lie. Lying to Lucius was like trying to outrun a storm. "He is begging for money again." Lucius walked into the room. He moved with that same heavy, predatory grace, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly beside her chair. He didn't ask to read the letter. He simply looked down at her face. "Will you send him any?" he asked. "No." Brianna met his gaze squarely. "He would only gamble it away. And you told me if I gave him a shilling, you would burn his house down. I happen to know you are ruthless enough to do it." Lucius's mouth twitched. He leaned a hip against the edge of her desk, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "What else does the letter say? Your pulse is jumping at the base of your throat. You only do that when you are calculating a risk." Brianna swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of the small, frantic flutter of her own skin under his intense scrutiny. She looked away, staring at the smeared ink of her brother's handwriting. "Anthony's wife has left him. She took her fortune and eloped," she said quietly. "He is ruined. The society gossips are devouring him." Silence stretched over the room, thick and heavy. A log popped in the fireplace, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. "And?" Lucius finally prompted, his gravelly voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Does this alter your calculations, Brianna? Do you regret that I did not leave you to your humiliation that night? You could have played the tragic martyr, waited for him to crawl back, and claimed a miserable, vindicated victory." Brianna looked up. Lucius's face was unreadable, a mask of cold stone, but his hands, gripped tightly against his biceps, betrayed his tension. He was waiting for her to confirm his deepest, most cynical belief about human nature, that everyone inevitably disappointed you. She stood up. She didn't retreat. She stepped into his space, forcing him to look down at her. She could smell the sharp, clean scent of the camphor soap she had ordered for him, mixing with the natural dark musk of his skin. "Anthony made a mathematical error," Brianna said, repeating the exact words he had spoken to her in the ballroom months ago. Her voice was steady, anchored by a deep, unwavering certainty. "He failed to value his assets. He invested in a volatile commodity and lost everything." She reached out, letting her fingers brush against the rough linen of his shirt, resting her hand flat against the solid, thudding heat of his chest. His heart was hammering a violent rhythm against her palm. "You, however," she continued, looking up into his pale, shocked eyes, "made the perfect calculation. You bought a manager, Lucius, but you gained a wife who would rather burn in the moors with you than ever return to a world of polite lies." Lucius stared at her. The mask of stone cracked, shattered, and fell away completely. The raw, desperate hunger underneath was terrifying in its intensity. He didn't speak a word of poetry. He didn't utter a flowery declaration of love. He moved. His large hands came down, gripping her waist with bruising, possessive force, pulling her flush against his solid frame. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. He bent his head, burying his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent as if he were starving for oxygen. His mouth was hot against her skin, pressing a desperate, crushing kiss against the jumping pulse at her throat. Brianna's hands flew up, tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She didn't pull away. She dragged him closer, answering his frantic need with a fierce, imperfect surrender of her own. She tasted salt and tea, and the sheer overwhelming reality of a man who finally realized he was no longer alone in his fortress. "I miscalculated," he breathed harshly against her jaw, his voice shaking with a vulnerability that tore at her heart. "I thought I wanted a ghost to haunt this house. I didn't want a pulse. I didn't want this terrifying noise in my head every time you walk into a room." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark, with a fierce, undeniable possession. "I am never letting you go," he swore, a brutal vow scraped from the very bottom of his soul. "Do you understand me? You are mine. The ledgers are closed. Brianna looked up at the scarred, ruthless, beautiful man who had saved her by treating her like a transaction. She smiled, a real, bright, triumphant smile that reached her eyes and banished the last lingering shadow of the ballroom. "I understand perfectly," she whispered, pulling his face back down to hers. "The investment has matured.